The year is 50 AD. Across North America, entire civilizations are abandoning their homes, not because of war, not because of disease, but because the climate itself is turning against them. In the next 10 years, these migrations will reshape the continent forever. And almost no one remembers it happened. Something changed beneath the radar of history. Between 50 and 60 AD, North America didn't face a single catastrophe, faced something slower, more terrifying. The climate shifted, not dramatically enough for ancient peoples to understand what was happening, but persistently enough to force them to choose, adapt, or abandon everything they'd built. This wasn't a sudden ice age. This was subtler. Summer growing shorter, winters holding on longer. The growing season that once stretched for months began shrinking to 3. Crops that thrived for generations suddenly struggled. The animals that fed entire communities began migrating toward warmer lands. For indigenous peoples living across the continent, this wasn't just weather changing. This was their world rearranging itself. We don't have written records from this period. Indigenous North America didn't use written language the way European civilizations did. But we have something better: the land itself. Archaeological evidence, tree rings, pollen deposits, and remnants of ancient settlements tell us a story that modern science can now read like pages in a book. And what those pages reveal is a population in motion, making impossible decisions about survival. The temperatures dropped just enough to matter. Maybe 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit during growing seasons. 4 people living on the edge of subsistence. Margins that small could mean the difference between a successful harvest and starvation. Entire communities that had called one place home for centuries began to realize they couldn't stay. Some moved north, seeking the warmth they'd lost. Others moved south to escape the growing cold. Some tried moving west toward different environments entirely. Still others adapted their entire way of life without leaving. This period, roughly 50 to 60 AD, represents one of the most dramatic population shifts in pre-Columbian North American history. Thousands of people were on the move simultaneously across the continent. The Great Plains tribes adjusted their hunting patterns. Eastern woodland communities relocated their villages. Southwestern peoples began experimenting with new crops and building methods. It was chaos and innovation happening in parallel. What makes this period remarkable is how invisible it is to most modern Americans. We know about the Ice Age, we know about the Dust Bowl, but this subtle shift in climate and the massive human response to it remains largely unknown. Yet for the people living through it, this decade was everything. It was the moment they had to prove they could survive when everything changed. It was when ancient America discovered how to bounce back. The Southwest felt the climate shift first and most brutally. The ancestral Pueblones had spent centuries building a sophisticated civilization in what we now call New Mexico and Arizona. They'd learned to coax water from dry land. They'd engineered irrigation systems that worked in one of the harshest environments on the continent. But around 50 AD, something fundamental broke in their carefully balanced system. The rivers began flowing less reliably. Springs that ran year-round started drying up for months at a time. The aquifers that had fed their communities slowly retreated deeper underground. Rainfall patterns shifted, becoming even more unpredictable than the harsh Southwest normally demanded. The ancestral Pueblones faced an unprecedented challenge. Their civilization was built on controlling water and water was abandoning them. Rather than collapse, they innovated. Archaeological evidence from this exact period shows a massive expansion in the construction of check dams and terraces designed to capture every drop of rainfall. They began building reservoirs and catchment systems more elaborate than anything they'd attempted before. Some communities moved to higher elevations where moisture was more consistent. Others relocated entirely to areas closer to permanent water sources, like the Rio Grande and San Juan rivers. This wasn't a gradual shift. Settlement patterns show that within a single generation, maybe 20 or 30 years, hundreds of communities had relocated. The population became concentrated in river valleys and in areas where underground water remained accessible. What had been a dispersed civilization spread across a wide region became increasingly nucleated, with larger populations gathering in smaller, more defensible locations. The ancestral pueblones developed entirely new agricultural techniques during this period. They began experimenting with different crop varieties that required less water. They pioneered methods of dry farming that allowed them to cultivate land without irrigation. They built storage facilities capable of preserving food for longer periods, creating buffers against crop failures. These innovations weren't gradual refinements of existing techniques. They were desperate solutions born from necessity. What's stunning is how successful they were. Despite climate deterioration, the Southwest's population actually grew during this period. Communities didn't abandon the region. They dug in, adapted their entire way of life, and emerged stronger and more efficient. They proved that humans could thrive even when the environment turned hostile. But this success came with a cost. Their societies became more hierarchical, more regimented, more focused on collective survival. The culture of the Southwest was being remade by climate crisis. While the Southwest was learning to fight the drought, the eastern woodlands were experiencing a different crisis. The climate cooling meant that the reliable growing season for corn, the staple crop that had driven the development of complex societies in the region, was becoming unreliable. The frost came earlier. Spring came later. The window for cultivation was closing. The Mississippian cultures and their predecessors had built their societies on the foundation of corn agriculture. That single crop had allowed them to create permanent settlements, accumulate surplus, and develop hierarchical social structures. Trade networks stretched across hundreds of miles, all of them fed by the agricultural productivity that corn made possible. Then climate shifted, and suddenly that foundation was cracking. Archaeological records show extensive settlement abandonment across the eastern woodlands during this period. Not complete abandonment. People didn't disappear, but villages that had been occupied for generations were being emptied. Large nucleated settlements were being broken into smaller, more mobile communities. The population was dispersing back into a more flexible settlement pattern that hadn't been common in the region for centuries. But this wasn't regression or failure. It was adaptation. Communities returned to a mixed subsistence strategy that combined corn agriculture with hunting, fishing, and gathering. They became semi-sedentary rather than permanently settled. Villages moved every few years instead of remaining fixed for centuries. This flexibility allowed them to adjust to year-to-year variations in climate and crop productivity. They became more resilient precisely by being less dependent on any single resource. Some eastern woodland communities moved northward, pushing into territories they'd previously abandoned as too cold for corn cultivation. Others moved westward toward the Mississippi River Valley, seeking new agricultural opportunities. Still others remained in their homelands, but fundamentally restructured their societies around a more mobile lifestyle. These weren't panic migrations, they were calculated shifts in settlement strategy. The social implications were profound. Hierarchical societies that depended on surplus agricultural production began flattening. Decision-making power redistributed from central authorities to smaller local groups. Trade networks that had connected the East to the Mississippi Valley and beyond began contracting. Distinct regional cultures began to form, each adapting to their specific local climate and environment. The unified Mississippian cultural system was fragmenting, replaced by a more heterogeneous collection of regional adaptations. This wasn't decline, it was transformation. The Great Plains occupied a strange middle ground during this climate shift. Unlike the Southwest, which faced drying, or the eastern woodlands, which faced shortened growing seasons, the plains experienced increasing variability. Wet years followed dry years in unpredictable sequences. Grassland productivity fluctuated. The herds of bison that moved across the plains in their ancient patterns began altering their routes, sometimes appearing where they'd previously been scarce, sometimes disappearing from traditional hunting grounds entirely. The peoples who lived on the plains had adapted to this unpredictability over millennia. Their entire culture was built around flexibility, on following resources rather than remaining fixed in one place. The climate shift of 50 to 60 AD didn't require them to abandon their way of life, but it did require them to become even more sophisticated in their understanding of environmental variation and resource distribution. Evidence from this period shows that plains peoples began developing increasingly specialized hunting strategies. Some communities focused more intensively on specific animal species, like elk or antelope, rather than relying exclusively on bison. Others began establishing multiple seasonal camps across larger territories, allowing them to move between different resource zones as conditions changed. Trade networks expanded as communities attempted to buffer against local resource scarcity by exchanging goods with distant neighbors. This was the period when many plains cultures developed the sophisticated knowledge systems that would later astound European observers' intimate understanding of animal migration patterns, ability to predict seasonal resource availability, and knowledge of vast territories spanning hundreds of miles. These weren't innate abilities. They were developed responses to climate crisis. Communities were forced to become more observant, more systematic, more intelligent in how they understood and used their environment. Some plains communities began incorporating more plant foods into their diet, shifting away from the heavy reliance on large game hunting. Wild rice in northern plains regions, various nuts and berries in prairie transition zones, and roots in areas where they were abundant became increasingly important caloric sources. This dietary diversification made them more resilient to variations in hunting success. The social organization of plains communities began changing too. Bands grew larger during this period, suggesting that communities were pooling resources and labor to handle increased variability. Decision-making structures became more formalized. Leadership roles became more specialized. These changes weren't dramatic transformations. Plains peoples maintained their essentially egalitarian social structures, but they were responding to environmental pressure by becoming more organized. The plains peoples were learning that survival in an unpredictable environment required cooperation at a larger scale than they'd previously organized. The Pacific coast of North America experienced the climate shift differently than interior regions. The cooling trend that devastated southwestern agriculture and shortened growing seasons in the east had a paradoxical effect on California's coast. It increased the productivity of ocean ecosystems. Cooler waters meant better circulation of nutrients, which meant more abundant fish, shellfish, and marine mammals. While inland peoples were struggling, coastal communities were experiencing a boom. The indigenous peoples of California, hundreds of distinct nations speaking dozens of languages, had long known that the ocean was a more reliable resource than terrestrial hunting or agriculture. But the climate shift of 50 to 60 AD made that advantage even more pronounced. Archaeological evidence shows rapid population growth along the California coast during this period. Shell middens, the accumulated remains of shellfish consumption, grow thicker in layers, dating to this era, indicating more intensive exploitation of marine resources. Coastal communities didn't just maintain their settlements during this period, they expanded them. Villages grew larger. New permanent settlements were established in previously marginal coastal locations. Some communities that had been semi-mobile began adopting more sedentary lifestyles because the coastal resources were now abundant enough to support year-round settlement. This was a reversal of the trend seen almost everywhere else in North America during the same period. The bounty of the Pacific allowed California's indigenous peoples to develop increasingly specialized and complex societies without depending on agriculture. They created sophisticated fishing technologies, hooks, nets, weirs, and traps that represented generations of accumulated knowledge. They developed processes for preserving fish through drying and smoking that allowed them to maintain food security through less abundant seasons. They created trade networks that carried marine resources inland, exchanging them for plant foods and materials not available on the coast. This prosperity had profound cultural effects. Coastal California societies began developing increasingly elaborate artistic traditions, sophisticated spiritual practices, and complex systems of wealth and status. Some areas developed hereditary leadership positions. Art and decoration became more elaborate. Ceremonial practices became more formalized. The relative abundance provided by productive ocean ecosystems allowed for cultural elaboration that would have been impossible with more marginal resources. However, this coastal advantage also created isolation. While interior peoples were being forced to migrate, trade, and connect with distant communities as they adapted to climate crisis, coastal California became increasingly focused on local resources and local relationships. Distinct regional cultures began solidifying. Trade with interior regions became more formal and less frequent. The Pacific coast began developing its own trajectory, increasingly separate from developments happening in the interior. Between the coastal paradises and the struggling interior lay the mountain and desert regions of the interior West. The Great Basin, the Colorado Plateau, the Rocky Mountains, these areas experienced the climate shift as increased aridity combined with temperature changes. The already marginal environments became even more marginal. Lakes shrank, springs dried up. The already sparse vegetation became even more sparse. Yet these regions didn't empty. Small communities persisted, adapting their ancient strategies to increasingly harsh conditions. This period saw the emergence of more specialized gathering techniques. Communities developed detailed knowledge of which plants could be eaten during extreme dry years. Storage technologies became more sophisticated. Smoking and drying techniques allowed preservation of the meager plant foods and small game available. Social networks expanded as communities maintained contact with neighbors across vast distances, allowing for mutual assistance during local resource failures. The Great Basin peoples of what we now call Nevada and Utah developed some of the most sophisticated gathering knowledge of any human population. This wasn't learned accidentally. Archaeological evidence from this period shows deliberate experimentation with different plant processing techniques, deliberate expansion of the range of plants considered edible, and deliberate construction of storage facilities designed to buffer against feast and famine cycles. The Colorado Plateau regions saw similar adaptations. Some communities moved toward higher elevations, seeking cooler, moister conditions. Others abandoned more marginal areas entirely, concentrating in the few remaining river valleys and springs capable of supporting permanent settlement. These weren't disasters. The population persisted and even slowly grew. But survival required constant vigilance and sophisticated knowledge systems. What's remarkable about these mountain and desert peoples is their success at remaining permanent in areas that seemed to be becoming less hospitable. Archaeological records show that some settlements remained occupied for centuries without interruption through this climate crisis. Communities developed such refined knowledge of their environments that they could extract a living from lands that seemed impossibly marginal. They knew which springs would have water in dry years. They knew which plants would be productive during particular climate conditions. They knew how to plan for scarcity. These isolated communities also developed increasingly distinct cultural traditions. Geographic separation from other regions meant that their adaptations took unique forms. Artistic styles became distinctive. Spiritual practices developed in isolation. Languages diverged. The mountain and desert West became a region of remarkable cultural diversity, with dozens of distinct peoples, each solving the adaptation problem in slightly different ways. By 60 AD, the cultural map of the interior West was becoming increasingly differentiated, each region refining its own solutions to environmental challenge. By 60 AD, North America had been fundamentally transformed by a decade of climate crisis and adaptation. The population had shifted, settlement patterns had changed, social structures had been reorganized. Trade networks had been redrawn, and perhaps most importantly, indigenous peoples had demonstrated something that would characterize them for the next 1,500 years: the capacity to adapt, innovate, and thrive even when circumstances shifted dramatically. The Southwest had evolved into a region of increasingly complex societies, organized around efficient water management. The eastern woodlands had restructured around flexibility and resilience. The Great Plains had become home to increasingly mobile, sophisticated peoples with detailed environmental knowledge. The Pacific Coast had emerged as a region of unparalleled prosperity and cultural elaboration. The Pacific Northwest had laid the foundation for the most sophisticated non-agricultural societies in the world. The interior mountains and deserts had become home to peoples whose knowledge of marginal environments was unmatched. What's crucial to understand is that this wasn't catastrophic collapse followed by rebuilding. It was continuous adaptation. Communities that faced crisis didn't disappear, they changed. People who found their environment shifting didn't abandon the continent. They moved to new locations or restructured their societies to thrive in altered conditions. This period, 50 to 60 AD, represents not the end of an era, but the beginning of a new one. The cultural patterns that emerged during this decade of climate stress would persist for centuries. The innovations developed during this crisis, new agricultural techniques in the Southwest, more flexible settlement patterns in the East, specialized hunting strategies on the plains, increasingly elaborate artistic traditions on the coasts would become defining characteristics of regional cultures. Each region had been tested by climate change and had emerged with distinct solutions. The continent that emerged from 60 AD was more culturally diverse, more regionally differentiated, and more sophisticated than what had existed a decade earlier. Perhaps most remarkably, this adaptation happened without written records, without centralized governments, without advanced technology. It happened through observation, experimentation, cooperation, and the willingness to restructure entire societies when circumstances demanded it. Indigenous North Americans didn't merely survive climate crisis, they used it as an opportunity to become more knowledgeable, more sophisticated, and more culturally diverse. This period reminds us that adaptation to environmental change isn't modern, it's ancient. It's written into human capacity. The peoples who thrived during this moment in North American history left no written accounts of their accomplishment. But they left something more permanent: the societies, the knowledge systems, and the cultural traditions that would characterize the continent for millennia to come. They proved that humans could face environmental crisis and emerge transformed for the better.